Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm going to be doing this drawing of the Witcher Medallion in colored pencils on toned paper. I already have a simple outline, but I'm going to have to draw a more elaborate sketch using a white colored pencil. I'm going to be using Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils, and I'm going to be working on this 6 x 9 inches toned paper. And I've toned this paper myself. I just used some black gouache. It's not exactly black, it's kind of matte. I also added a touch of clear gesso to it to get a slightly more textured surface, but it's mostly just regular drawing paper, a slightly smaller size this time. I wanted to see what this medallion would look like on a darker background, on toned paper. And like I said, I'm going to be using these Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils, only a few of them, white, black, warm grey and red. The Witcher Medallion is kind of a complex object. It's a metallic object, so I'm going to have to try to imitate the texture of metal. And I'm going to have to try to get all of these shapes right. It looks like an angry wolf. And the medallion is based off a computer game, the PC game, not the TV series. I don't watch TV much, honestly, I have to admit. I also have to admit that I only played the first Witcher game. I haven't played the other two, either because I wasn't interested or because I didn't have the time. I don't really play any computer games anymore. Just don't have the time for it, but I have enjoyed the first part of The Witcher. It was a very engaging experience. Now let me get back to the drawing process. I'm going to have to try to keep this white color pencil sharp at all times, and I already started drawing some edges of the medallion. These lighter edges, which are supposed to look like reflective, shiny parts of this metal object. For the shadow areas, I'm going to be using either this grey or black, or a combination of the two. Actually, the warm grey is going to be pretty much my base tone, but I'm just going to be sort of mixing all of these colors together and allowing them to layer and overlap, and just sort of emphasizing the contrast in certain areas, because contrast is key here for a number of reasons. First, because it's a very complex object with a complex shape, and I'm going to need a very nice range of value, and I'm going to need to explain all of these irregular shapes to the viewer by using lots of shadows and using that range of value. And of course the other reason is because I'm going to need to try to make it look like it's made out of metal. And with metal you have a lot of these contrasts. Now notice what I'm doing around the edges here. I'm trying to make it look like the edges are slightly scratched, and I'm drawing some of these lighter details to kind of enhance that texture of the metal. I'm going to be doing that a lot throughout the drawing process, because metallic objects, their surface can be rough or it can be smoother. It depends on what kind of metallic object you're drawing, but what they all have in common is this contrast and a great range of value, because parts of it are reflective or shiny. So I started with the ear on the left, and the ears are kind of curved for some reason. They almost look like horns. I don't know why that is so, but that's just the design of the medallion. I always thought that the medallion was a very interesting object in the game, very interesting design. I also did a drawing of the Witcher on a few occasions. I did one drawing of Geralt based on the reference from the first game. I did a drawing of him based on the reference from the TV series, and I'm going to put the link in the description if you want to check that one out, and in the end screen as well. And now I'm doing this drawing of a medallion. This was actually suggested by one of my patrons, because she said that she really likes this technique of drawing on toned paper, black paper, with colored pencils, and I thought that why not, I should try one too. But I wanted to try a smaller sketch. Whenever you're experimenting, it's a good idea to work on a smaller size paper. That way, if things go really wrong, you don't waste that much time. But this is not that complicated in the sense that like for example portraits or things like that, it's mostly just a complex looking object. But the most challenging bit here is of course trying to imitate that texture of metal. And working around the eyes here, I shaded the eye socket and I added the red for the eyes. Some medallions are mostly grey toned, and some of them have a bit of red for the eyes. I decided to add a touch of red just to make the drawing a little more interesting, a little more colourful. I didn't want it all to be just kind of grey and black and white. I'm adding in these shadow areas because you can see that these spiky things that are coming out on the sides, that's like that's supposed to be the longer hair around the wolf's head and the neck, and it's been drawn to look as spikes because it is a medallion and it's supposed to look like an artificial man-made object. Now each of these spiky things is kind of sticking out, and the part that is sticking out is getting more light because it's closer to the light source. The part that is tucked in closer to the head of the wolf is going to be darker. That's why I'm putting darker value there, and that's why I'm putting a bit more shadow. Now because I'm using a reference of a photo of a medallion, there's going to be some shadows and some reflections on it. I'm not really sure what the light source was and what it looked like. I'm just going to try to imitate what I see. And in this case, with this spike on the left side, you can see that there is a bit of reflected light coming from below. That's why the lower side is a little bit lighter. But the edges are generally lighter because they're sticking out and they're getting more light. And also you can imagine that the metal got a little bit scratched there around the edges. That's why the metal is a bit lighter there, like maybe some sort of a paint was scratched there. And I'm also putting in some of those tiny scratches in the shadow area just to break up the monotony. And now I'm going to do a little bit more work on this chain. The chain is also fairly complex. It's probably as complex as the medallion itself. It consists of a number of these rings which are connected together. So there are a number of challenges here. First, obviously it's a complex shape because we have a whole bunch of these rings and they're overlapping. And the other thing that's making it complicated is the fact that this is also made out of metal, so a metallic object is going to be reflective, and so there's also going to be shadows, so the reflections, the shadows, the shapes. You can see why this is going to be a little bit more complex to draw. But my approach was to draw the outline first and try to figure out the shape first using a white colored pencil, and then I thought later I'll just deal with shading and values. But first I need to try to figure out the shape and explain the shape to myself first, so that I can explain it to the viewer later. That's probably the most important thing when you're drawing complex things. First you need to try to understand what you're drawing, and then later you can try to figure out a way to convey that to the viewer. After that I started putting in some of those reflective areas, shiny areas which are lighter, using a white colored pencil, and then I started putting in the darker areas using a black pencil. One of the things, back when I was a kid and when I was trying to draw comics, and when I was sort of imitating what I saw in the comic books, one of the first things I learned about drawing metal objects or reflective objects was that you need to have that strong contrast between lighter and darker areas, and that just kind of produces a realistic looking metallic objects. There's a bit of shadow in between these rings. As you can see, I'm adding a bit of shadow there, and in the part of the ring which is sticking out, because they're round and one part is always going to be closer to the light source, and that part is going to be lighter. So I did the left side of that chain, and I only sketched out the right side. I'm going to do that later. Right now I'm back to working on the wolf's head, adding this angular area where the forehead is supposed to be, and adding a bit more texture and a bit more of these lighter details to the sides, because this top part is kind of facing towards the light source, and because it's so angular, these corners are going to be a lot lighter. They're going to be catching more light. I'm going to put in a little bit of grey as well for the mid-tone, and of course I'm going to use the black for the shadow areas. Now, one of the things I used in addition to the colored pencils was a charcoal pencil. I used that in those areas where I felt like my black colored pencil just wasn't dark enough, because the background is already pretty dark, and sometimes it's difficult for a black colored pencil to stand out against that background. And another thing that often happens is when you're layering pencils, and when you put the black colored pencil on top of a lighter pencil, it sometimes ends up muddying things and not being dark enough. So one of the things that I did to push the range of value and to increase the depth by adding those pitch black areas, I actually used a bit of charcoal pencil rather than a black colored pencil, because I just felt like the black colored pencil wasn't really dark enough for some of the darkest bits. But I found that this combination of black pencil and white pencil worked really well, because as I was blending these, I was also producing a nice bit of texture that kind of looked like rough surface of the metal. And at one point I almost felt like I didn't really need that warm grey for the mid-tone, maybe just a little bit to modify the overall tone and for some of the mid-tones, but I could easily have gotten away with just using black and white to create this realistic looking metallic object. So I'm making more progress, moving on to the other ear on the right. The medallion is not going to be perfectly symmetrical, neither in terms of shape nor in terms of values and reflections, because the light source varies a little bit, plus I'm using freehand method, so I'm not going to get proportions 100% accurate. Some of them are going to be a little bit off, but I'm trying to kind of trying to correct them as I go along, trying to make some details a little bit more symmetrical. So these eye sockets were a little bit different at first, so I had to do a little bit of fixing to try to make them more symmetrical. And it's the same thing with these spiky shapes on the right side. I had to make a few corrections. And I did those corrections mostly using a kneaded eraser, because I tried avoiding using the regular eraser, because on this tone paper it can produce some effects that I don't really like. So I'm working on the ear on the right, adding in these shadow areas, and as you can see, I add the darker bits first, and then some mid-tone, and then I add some of these lighter details. With the lightest parts around the tip of the ears, where there is a lot of that lighter value, where the metal is the most reflective, I have to use a bit more pressure, and I have to use a sharp pencil. If you're wondering if you could just do this on regular paper, of course you could, but you would have to take a different approach. With the tone paper, we have the advantage that these lighter areas, these highlights, stand out against the darker background. And another thing which I already mentioned, I added a drop of clear gesso to the gouache mixture, and that's why it kind of grips the colored pencil a little bit better. The surface is mostly smooth. I didn't really use that much gesso, but I guess I added just enough so that it would allow me to layer the colored pencils a little bit more easily, because gesso has that effect. I've been kind of experimenting with clear gesso in some of my other drawings. I'm sure if you've been following my channel, you could see that I've used it with some of the previous videos. With colored pencils, it often produces too much texture, but when I mix it in with some water and some gouache, the texture is a lot smoother, so it's more manageable. I mean, you could just work on regular darker toned paper. It doesn't have to be black. You could just buy whichever toned paper you like, and it would still work just as well, I think, or nearly as well. Because these Faber-Castell white color pencils are really strong. They create really strong highlights, and you can often put them on top of other areas if you didn't press too hard. I'm drawing this jaw area, the teeth, and the reflections on the tongue. This area is a little bit complex. The darker bits here are for the nostrils. Just trying to put some indications of some darker areas on the snout, even though the snout area itself is going to be a lot lighter, because it's kind of sticking out, and the objects that are sticking out, they're always going to be getting more light from the light source. So I made some indications of darker areas first, but now I'm going to be going over that with a considerable amount of white colored pencil, because I want to make that whole area a lot lighter. And of course, around the edges, again, I'm going to put in some stronger highlights. Now in this mouth area, I'm putting some shadows around the teeth and the tongue. The tongue itself is a little bit reflective in some areas, and the teeth are also reflective and a little bit lighter because they're sticking out. But I can't really make it exactly as it is in the reference. I'm going to have to try to approximate a little bit. And it's okay to simplify and approximate even when you're doing realistic drawings. In fact, that often helps you do realistic drawings, because often when you're trying to copy something and do a photorealistic drawing, you can get caught up in the texture, and paradoxically ends up looking less realistic than it could have. So sometimes simplifying things and approximating things is the way to go, but you have to try to make sure that you understand what it is that you see. because if you don't really understand what you see, it can be a little bit difficult to explain it to the viewer. I feel like this right side of this spiky area of the head is a little bit darker, like there's a little bit more shadow there. You can see that there are some shadows and reflections on this side. So I'm going to make that side a little bit darker overall. I'm probably going to do a longer version of this eventually on Patreon. On Patreon you can find full-length narrated videos and more content, so you should check that out if you're interested. Also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you like my content, and don't forget to click the notification icon so that you can be notified about future uploads if you want. You can also check out my other videos. I have lots of other stuff. I draw all kinds of things. I'm kind of wrapping things up with this drawing of Witcher Medallion, and I'm just going to put my signature in the lower right corner. I'm going to use a red colored pencil. I thought that it would be a nice touch. So that's the finished drawing. I hope you like the texture. I hope it looks realistic, like a real metallic object. I want to thank you for watching, and of course I'm going to see you in the next video. Bye for now.